Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Primary Sources 2015 Global Read. My name is Deborah Cunningham, and I'm the Senior Program Director here at Primary Source. I'm joined today by Karen Storrs, our librarian, who will co-facilitate this webinar with me. We're so pleased to have you all with us this rainy afternoon, wherever you are in the Boston area, the U.S., or beyond. This is Primary Source's 6th annual Global Read event. Today we'll be discussing Looking for Transwonderland, Travels in Nigeria, the witty and vivid travelogue by the Nigerian-born author Noo Saro-Wiwa, who is joining us live from the United Kingdom today. This is the first time our selected book has focused on Nigeria, which is probably overdue since Nigeria is a country famous for its writers. I hope you've enjoyed Noo's book as much as we have at Primary Source, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts about it this afternoon. Before we get to Noo's story and Nigeria, I want to pause for a moment to introduce Primary Source, since some of you may be joining us for the first time tonight. As you can see here in this slide, we're a nonprofit organization started by teachers for teachers, with a specific goal of bringing the wider world in all of its color and complexity to students. We do this through professional development programs focused on global content, both face-to-face and online. We also produce multimedia resource guides and curricula about world cultures and topics, which you can access through our website. And whenever we can, we bring teachers on international study tours to experience the world firsthand and bring it back to their students. In that spirit of learning about the world, or at least visiting it vicariously, I'd like to introduce our two presenters today. Noo Saro-Wiwa is a British-Nigerian author and journalist who has written for publications like The Guardian newspaper, The Independent, and The Times Literary Supplement, as well as travel guides for Lonely Planet and Rough Guides. Looking for Transwonderland is her first book, which, as you know, chronicles her return to Nigeria some years after the death of her father, the environmental activist Ken Saro-Wiwa. In 2012, her book was chosen as the Sunday Times Travel Book of the Year, and The Guardian named it one of the 10 best contemporary books on Africa. I encourage you to visit her website at www.noosarowiwa.com, where you can find links to more of her writing and where you can learn the correct pronunciation of her name, which is Noo. Darren Q, our second presenter, is a professor at UMass Boston in the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance. He's also the executive director of the Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development. Darren studies and writes about the connection between democratic institution building in Africa, especially Nigeria, and the development of political cultures that support democracy, particularly the role that civil society groups play in this development. Darren has worked with the Council on Foreign Relations to provide analysis and blueprints for preventing conflicts in areas such as Nigeria, Central Africa, and Kosovo. And he's been a consultant to the UN, USAID, the U.S. State Department, and several NGOs, including the NGO known as Primary Source in the past. Our program for the Global Read today will be to lead with a presentation by Noo about her book and her journey, followed by a presentation by Darren on contemporary Nigeria and its challenges and hopes. Both speakers welcome you to post questions or comments as they speak, and we encourage you to do so as we genuinely want this session to be interactive and responsive to your interests. The presenters will take questions during or after their prepared remarks, so please don't hesitate to participate by using the chat box at the lower left of your screen. We'll have a Q&A period of about 30 minutes, and then wrap up with a brief introduction to our amazing Looking for Transwonderland toolkit for teachers, created by Karen, and with closing remarks from our presenters. You will all receive a link to the recorded webinar in a few days, so you can go back and hear it again. The only part actually that won't be captured in that recording is what we post in the chat box. So if there's a link that you want to preserve, you'll have to note it as we go. With that introduction, I'd like to hand the mic over now to our author, Noo Saro-Wiwa. Welcome. And Noo, if you just want to press your talk button, you will be live.
All right. Thanks very much for coming, everyone. I'm here to discuss my journey that I took around Nigeria in 2007, 2008, which resulted in my book, Looking for Transwonderland. I started in the capital city, Lagos, which I think you can see in the slide. Lagos is, it was the capital city of Nigeria up until the sort of 1980s, and then it was the capital was transferred to Abuja. But Lagos is still the largest city in the country, and it's huge. I mean, no one knows how many people actually live there. It could be anything from 10 million to 20 million people. It's definitely bigger than New York, and it's possibly the size of New York and LA combined. So you get a sense of just how huge it is. It's basically the economic engine of Nigeria, and so everyone comes here. It's you have just thousands of people pouring in from the countryside every day. And as you can see in this photo, people have built shanty towns stretching out onto the water because there's so little space in the city. But these shanty towns are almost like little cities themselves. They have like an education system, they've got shops, businesses. They really are sort of functioning urban entities in themselves. But unfortunately, the government has sort of started demolishing a lot of them in its efforts to develop the city, and so that's an ongoing problem where poor people are just you know, forced out of their homes and you know, have nowhere to stay. So you know, that's a big problem in the city. But recently, Lagos has had a governor called Fashola, who's made some real attempts to clean up the city. And as you can see in this photo, he's created a bus lane for buses to go down. And so, you know, it's a city that's changing rapidly. The thing with Lagos is that it's so huge. I mean, when I arrived there, I was absolutely terrified because I didn't know the city. I didn't know how I was going to travel around. And it's very, very intimidating. You've got so many poor people, but you've also got some of the richest people in Nigeria as well, all living in this one city. And so it's amazing. It's really exciting. And depending on who you talk to, some people will say, oh, Lagos is a nightmare. It's crowded, it's polluted. I couldn't live there. And then you talk to someone else and they will tell you that it's the party capital of Africa. You know, you've got so many clubs, restaurants. You can go windsurfing if you want. It's got everything. So it's, you know, it's a really amazing city. And I think when I was there, what I noticed more than anything else was just how religious people were. You know, I'd get into a bus to get across town, and I found that, you know, people would start praying on the bus. So, you know, Nigeria is an extremely religious country. The south is predominantly Christian, and the north is predominantly Muslim. But you've got Christians living in the north, and you've got pockets of Islam in the south as well. So it's a complicated picture, but generally speaking, it's the Muslim north, the Christian south. And so in Lagos, you see so many churches everywhere, and there are lots of religious signs on the buses. And, you know, so Christianity is a very, very, it's the, you know, the center of life in Nigeria. But, you know, there's been a real proliferation of churches as well. You know, religion has become a business in Nigeria, and this started in the 1980s when people didn't have jobs. The government introduced lots of policies that cut back on government spending. So there was a lot of unemployment around. But around the same time, you had people who'd been living in the United States who'd been influenced by Pentecostal Christianity in Nigeria. And they brought that sort of Christianity back to Nigeria. And it really appealed to people, because up until then, Nigeria was very, Nigerian Christianity was very kind of Catholic or Anglican, very traditional, quiet prayer, and just not very charismatic. But then this Pentecostalism came over from the US, and you had these preachers who were very flamboyant. As you can see in this photo, the guy on the right-hand side who's wearing a white suit, he is one of the biggest preachers in Nigeria. He's called Chris Oyakilome, and he's worth about $50 million. His church is it's called Christ Embassy, and it has about 40,000 members, and it's one of the biggest churches in the whole of Africa. And he's made a lot of money from this. But in Nigeria, wealth and spirituality intertwined. Pastors display their wealth as a way of, showing that they're doing God's work. So, wealth isn't frowned upon. And so you get, you'll see magazines in Nigeria where they celebrate these pastors, and they call them the jet set pastors. And they really are the jet set. They have private airplanes, as you can see in this photo. And they show them off in magazine articles. So it's a very kind of bizarre type of Christianity, but people love it because there's so much poverty in Nigeria, and because the government have been so ineffectual. They're very corrupt. They don't build roads. They don't provide the kind of jobs, the number of jobs that they should provide. And so people turn to Christianity as a way of getting rich, or sustaining themselves spiritually. And so it's become a very big business. And you've got a lot of very good churches who do a lot of good. They do charity work and they support the poor and the ill. But you get a lot of people who are just con men, basically, and they set up churches just as a way of stealing money from people, or even abusing. Sexually abusing girls or boys. So that's a bit of a problem in Nigeria. And so for me, as someone who doesn't really go to church, it was quite a struggle explaining that to people. And actually, most of the time, I didn't explain that to people. I kept it quite quiet. It's a sort of country where people expect you to be very pious and religious, a bit like the US in some respects. But yes, if you go to Nigeria, you'll come away with a very strong sense of its religious beliefs. So anyway, after I was in Lagos, I then moved on to a city called Ibadan, which is one of the biggest cities in Nigeria. It's about 3 hours north of Lagos, and it's where my father studied. Ibadan has what was one of the best universities in Africa. It was built by the British, modelled on a British university, and some of the top African thinkers studied there. So I went and paid a visit, but like many things in Nigeria, the quality has gone down quite a bit. There's not enough funding, and the population has increased, and so there's less spending per student as there used to be. So it's quite sad. You go to the English department and they have so few books. I think even my personal book collection is bigger than the whole department's book collection. And so the students are struggling. But when I ask them, well, what do you do for fun? they told me that they were putting on an annual dog show the next day. And I was amazed at this. I thought I had no idea that Nigerians were really interested in dogs. I think of that as being a more Western thing. Europeans and Americans, they love dogs. But it turns out that Nigerians love dogs too. And the vet students at the university put on this dog show every year, and it was fascinating because all the dogs in this competition tended to be kind of dogs that you associate with aggression. They were like Rottweilers and Alsatians and Pit Bull Terriers, that kind of thing, because Nigeria doesn't really have that many pedigree dogs because they're too expensive. But it was amazing. You just saw these crowds of people, and they were really enthusiastic about these dogs. But the whole show is nothing like what you're used to in the US or Europe. I think one dog urinated in front of the crowd, and everyone loved that. They were like clapping and whatnot. But it's a very kind of Nigerian style dog show. This was like one of several events and things that I saw in Nigeria that really changed my perception of the country. Because this is the kind of stuff you don't really see in the media. You have to go to Nigeria to actually discover these things. It's just it was amazing to see that, and really heartwarming. And this is what Nigeria is really about. People making the best of a bad situation. So this dog show was like one of the highlights of my trip. I then moved on north. We're still in the southwest of Nigeria, which is dominated by the Yoruba ethnic group. They're a huge ethnic group, one of the biggest in Nigeria. And they have a religion, the Yoruba religion, which is very ancient and complicated. And their kind of churches, as it were, are these shrines. And they're always situated in forests, in these sacred forests. So the one that you can see here, this is the Oshogbo Shrine, which is, it had been kind of neglected in recent decades. I think once the British colonialists came to Nigeria, people were discouraged from pursuing traditional animist religions, and so they turned to Christianity, they turned to Islam from the jihads, the holy wars that took place in the 19th century. And so shrines like these started to go into decline, and they just became overgrown, and people forgot about them. But then in the 1950s, it was actually an Austrian woman, an artist called Suzanne Wenger. She came to Nigeria and she fell in love with the Yoruba religion and decided to revive these shrines. And so what you see here are sculptures and sort of temples that she and some local artists basically built in the 1960s. And so it's just this really beautiful place. After you've been in the cities in Nigeria, which are always really hectic and polluted and crowded, you come to these sacred groves, and it's just beautiful. They're set in this quiet forest. You're walking around, there are all these sculptures everywhere. There's rivers, trees, there are monkeys in the trees. It's wonderful, even if you're not religious, it's almost a religious experience in itself, just being here. It's very, very calming. And, this Yoruba religion is, it's very powerful. Even the Africans who were sent over to the Americas as slaves, they maintained this religion. Not so much in the United States. In the United States, they made sure that the slaves were divided up into different nationalities so that they couldn't really maintain their cultural identity. But if you go to Cuba and Brazil and places like that, you will still see remnants of this religion, practiced quite strongly. So, it's a very, very big part of African, culture, the diaspora culture, and yeah, and it's just wonderful. I then moved up to the north, and what you're seeing here is it was just a man that I came across in the city of Kano, which is the biggest city in northern Nigeria and one of the biggest cities in Nigeria as a whole. So Kano is like, it's an ancient city. It's about 1,000 years old, and it was at the center of the trans-Saharan trade. So it, you know, became a really sort of important center, and for hundreds of years it's had connections with Mali and North Africa, and so you had these like nomadic herdsmen called the Fulani, and they became Muslims, I think maybe around the 12th to 14th century, around that time. And so they migrated to Kano in northern Nigeria and integrated with the local Hausa people. They're the main ethnic group there. And so, you know, they formed this kind of joint sort of ethnic group, as it were. And in the 17th and 18th century, Kano became the center of Islamic scholarship. And, you know, because of its trade, you had traders traveling as far as the Mediterranean and as far as Gabon, which is kind of near Central Africa. So these people were going far and wide and just picking up culture and ideas from other places, and they brought it back to Kano. So Kano was a very sophisticated place, and, you know, relative to the rest of the region. And, you know, you had literacy. People had Qurans. They were writing with ink as far back as, you know, the 14th century. And so, you know, it was, you know, an incredibly advanced place. And if you go to a museum today, you'll see in the museum like guns that they just see, like they got like these wooden guns from the 13th century, which I think have been brought over by an English knight, if I remember correctly, or a German knight or something. So, you know, it's a very sort of international place. And so, you know, Kano became this area where people exchanged salt and silks and perfumes, and Islamic books and weapons. And I think at one point, I think by the 18th century, you had about 300 camel loads of cloth being sent to Timbuktu, which is a major city in the country of Mali, what's known today as Mali. So yeah, it was, you know, very, very exciting place to be, Kano, back in the day. But by the time Nigeria got independence from the British in the 1960s, the North was kind of, it fell behind the Christian South, because the British, they decided to send their missionaries to educate southern Christian Nigerians, you know, give them a Western education, but they left the North alone. You know, I think they were quite intimidated by the North with its old culture, and but they also, you know, had a respect for it, and, you know, felt that it was actually quite useful to maintain this northern culture and just, you know, rule over that part of the country indirectly. So the photo you see here is a guy working at an indigo dye pit, and this is another example of Kano's amazing culture. These dye pits have been around since the 15th century, and they make these beautiful indigo dyed cloths, and it's a very sort of old method. This guy has been, you know, he's probably been doing this for 50 years, and he's probably the 10th generation in his family to be doing this. And so his, you know, his ancestors would have been doing this in exactly the same way. But unfortunately, it's a dying art, partly because of the Islamic insurgency that we've seen in the last few years. And this is the annual horse parade that's held at the Emir's Palace. And it's basically all the Emir's sons and the aristocracy of the region. They all mount their horses and show their allegiance to the Emir. So this amazing horse parade. They all put on these beautiful costumes, and they get on their horses and display their loyalty to their leader. And it's so popular that it's become this real spectacle, and you get expats, sort of people from the British Embassy, the US Embassy, coming along to watch it. And it's, it really is like one of the highlights of a visit to Nigeria. But again, because of the Islamic terrorism problem that we're now having, I think they've had to cancel this horse parade in the last few years. So that's a real shame. But it's absolutely stunning. They dress up the horses, and you get these and the horsemen. I think depending on what they're wearing, you can tell if they're princes, if they're the sons of the emir, based on their headgear. They tie the cloth to look like bunny rabbits, and that signifies that they're a prince. So yeah, it's a wonderful spectacle. But I don't know, the culture in northern Nigeria is very feudalistic. It's all about the emirs at the top who are very rich, and then you've got the peasants at the bottom of society. And because they didn't have so much Western education, it means that economically the north is very far behind the south, and you've got a lot of poverty, a lot of illiteracy, and you have these like street kids, as you can see in this photo, not the girl on the left, but perhaps the boy in the middle. You see a lot of them. They're called Almajiri boys, and they don't appear to have parents or anything. I don't know where they come from, but they're just beggars on the streets. And I think a lot of if they get any education at all, it's in a madrasa, where they're taught the Quran, but they're not taught maths or any of those kind of subjects that will actually lead to them getting decent jobs. Not that there are any decent jobs anyway in the north. And so you can see where you can see the roots of terrorism in Nigeria. It's boys like these that you see on the streets who have no education, no prospects, and so terror groups like Boko Haram offer them a way out. It gives them a sense of purpose. It gives them status, that they wouldn't have otherwise. And so, it's a real problem. Part of their concern, the reason why they like, for example, they kidnapped those girls from that town called Chibok a couple of years ago, and so they have a real problem with girls being educated. And again, that's based on an insecurity. If the boys themselves aren't educated, if the boys don't have jobs and money, then they don't want to see girls getting ahead, girls getting a Western education and getting jobs, especially in a society that's very male-dominated. They're very threatened by that, and that's partly why they target girls and kidnap them and do God knows what with them. So it's a very sort of dangerous situation in Nigeria. And so Kano, which was once the center of sophistication and literacy in Nigeria, has kind of fallen behind slightly compared to the south. But the culture is still there. If you go to Kano, you see these examples of beautiful traditional architecture, and it's still a wonderful place. I then moved on. I went further north, close to the border with Niger, where you have the Nguru wetlands. And again, that whole area is kind of desert. You've got sand dunes. You can see like camels crossing from the Sahara. Really beautiful. But then in between all of this sandy desert, you then have lots of these lakes, and it's really beautiful. And then again, I traveled. I got on a boat and I met up with some local ornithologists, and they had binoculars, and we went bird watching. And it was just a side to Nigeria that I didn't really know existed. It's really, really beautiful. You've got all these birds like cormorants and egrets flying around, and lilies on the water. It's very sort of soothing, calming place. So Nigeria could be an amazing tourist destination if the government get its act together and improve infrastructure and safety. But you can still go and have a really good time, nevertheless. But you have to put up with not so great hotels and not such great buses and roads and that sort of thing. I then moved on to a town that's up in the mountains in the far northeast corner of Nigeria, quite close to the Cameroon border. It's called Suku. And Suku is really interesting in that it's described as being a Stone Age village. People still sort of smelt iron in the same way that they did back in the Stone Age. And what makes Suku really unique is the fact that it has these terraces on its hill slopes where they look like steps, and that's where they grow, I think it's rice or some other kind of crop. But what's really unusual about Suku is that they use these terraces not just to grow rice, but also to bury their dead. So I think it's probably the only place in the world where the farms also operate as cemeteries, at least for the elite. So it's really interesting, and I think it's a UN World Heritage site, and it's wonderful. You walk around and everything's made of stone. It's really beautiful, and it's set in these mountains, the Mandara Mountains, which rise up from the plains as you're driving towards the northeast of the country, and it's really, really beautiful place.
No, this is Deb just interjecting for one moment, just to give you sort of a 5-minute warning so that we can make sure to leave time. We already have a lot of questions coming through, so
okay.
5-minute warning.
Okay, I'll speed it up. And so and then I then moved down to Jos, which is in the center of Nigeria, and here is where Islam meets Christianity, because it's bang in the center of the country. So you've got a lot of clashes between Christians and Muslims, but it's a really great place. It's got beautiful rocky landscapes, and you can go to the zoo where I saw these two giant tortoises mating. And then they've got the Yankari Game Reserve, which is I think our most famous game reserve. You can see lions and buffalo and things like that. And you've got these Wiki Springs, the natural springs, amazing. It looks like a swimming pool, but it's completely natural. And then I went further down south to Calabar, which is, I think, my favorite city in Nigeria. It's really well run. You have a governor who's made a real effort to clean up the city and improve tourism. So, if you ever wanted to go to Nigeria as a tourist, I would recommend this corner of the country. It's the southeast corner of the country, and it's beautiful. They make a real effort to make it look nice. And so I went to a wedding. I didn't know any of the people at this wedding. I was just walking along the street, and I saw that it was happening, and they just encouraged me to sit down and take part, which is amazing. And that's another thing that you don't see this in in the US or Europe. You know, you can't just rock up to a wedding and take part, but you can do that in Nigeria. So you can see this couple getting married, and these are sort of local dancers from the ethnic group in southeastern Nigeria. They're called the Efik, and you've got these amazing, colourful dancers. And you also have masquerades. These are a big part of Nigerian culture, or southern Nigerian culture. And again, they're absolutely stunning. They come in all different colours and designs, and you get a lot of them roaming around the cities and the countryside around Christmas time. And they're just absolutely beautiful. And they come in all different colours and sizes. And it's basically people who are dressing up with these masks which are supposed to embody a spirit. So they don't talk to you, and but you know, they kind of walk around and they're supposed to have special powers. But yeah, they're amazing. And then these they're called the Insibidi monoliths. They're one example of Nigeria's history that's just, you know, extremely mysterious. No one knows who built these rocks, or what the carvings on them mean. The Nigerian countryside, you know, around Calabar is full of these things. And so, you know, that's the problem. A lot of African history is unexplained. You know, it's only been recently discovered, or, you know, unearthed, unburied. And so it makes you wonder, you know, it makes you wonder what else is lying there under the ground. You know, our history is so rich and deep, and that, you know, relatively unexplored. This is the Obudu cattle ranch. Again, it's in the southeast corner of Nigeria. It's really high up at altitude, so you don't see any palm trees. It's very cool. So the British and the Scottish, they love this place, and you know, they grew strawberries and things like that in colonial times. But now it's become a hotel resort, and it's lovely. And what you're looking at here is the golf course. And so if you want a respite, you want to get away from Nigeria's heat and chaos, this is a really nice place to go to. You feel almost like you're in England, and you can go horse riding, that kind of thing. So, you know, really, really nice. And then a few miles further north, you've got the Afi Drill Ranch, which is run by an American woman who decided to try and conserve Nigeria's last few primates. So we've got lowland gorillas, we've got chimpanzees, and we've got what you're looking at here, drill monkeys. They're sort of like baboons, but they've got these amazing backsides. The fur is like just pink and blue, and just phenomenal. But again, you know, these are very few Nigerians actually visit places like the Afi Drill Ranch, and I didn't really know about it until, you know, I decided to take this trip. So, you know, we have so much as a country going for us, and so, you know, it'd be wonderful if we could, you know, have a government that could, you know, improve things in the country so that people could come over and visit, you know. Because I think out of all the countries in West Africa, Nigeria has the most exciting scenery, the most exciting animals, culture, you know, really wonderful place. There aren't many of these chimpanzees left. I think there are about maybe 200 left, and a lot of them are related to each other, so it's a bit of a problem from a breeding perspective. But yeah, you know, this ranch is doing really well in conserving them and making sure that they don't die out. And then finally, this is where I'm from, Ogoniland, and that's where all the oil is can be found in Nigeria. They discovered oil in 1956. And so Nigeria is now, I think, maybe the 14th biggest oil producer in the world. But it's come at a real cost for my people in Ogoniland. You've got these oil spills that take place on a yearly basis. I mean, you know, I think the Americans, you guys have that massive oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and that was, you know, a huge deal. In Nigeria, we have those kind of oil spills all the time, you know, almost every other year. So that, you know, that gives you a sort of idea of just how serious the environmental damage is. And, you know, this is what my father was fighting, campaigning for. You know, he wanted this kind of thing to stop and for it to be cleaned up. So, you know, our new government has promised to set aside some money to, you know, to clean up the environment, but whether it actually happens or not remains to be seen. But you know, this is one of the, you know, the biggest problems that we have at the moment in Nigeria. It's environmental, it's economic, it's political, it's all intertwined. You know, this corruption means that oil companies can create these oil spills, and they don't have someone like Obama to force the oil companies to pay up money and clean up the mess. And people who live in the local area, they're really poor. And so they steal the oil sometimes, and that can sometimes contribute to oil spills as well. But, you know, it's a largely agricultural area. And so when you have these oil spills and you know, you've got this oil, like, you know, filling up our rivers, it means that people can't fish, they can't grow crops, and their basic, you know, livelihoods are being threatened. And so, you know, it's a real problem in Nigeria. And so that's, yeah, I think that's where I ended my trip. And I came away, you know, with sort of very mixed views on Nigeria. I saw so much that was beautiful and stunning and wonderful, but then, you know, you see things like this that make you rather depressed. So it's, you know, it's an interesting country. There's so much to be happy about and optimistic about, but, you know, there's a lot of pessimism as well. But, you know, we have the ability to turn things around, and I hope that's what will happen in the next kind of half century.
No, thank you. That was
much.
a wonderful introduction to your trip. And I wanted to just allow one question right now because it's so relevant to the pictures you've been showing, and then we'll have more after Darren's presentation. But Marcy Prager wants to know, she says, your visuals match the words you write so well. Why did you not include some of these photos in the book?
Oh, well, I should say, the first 10 photos, the ones of Lagos and the Christianity ones, they were from the internet. I didn't take them. But yeah, all the other ones I did. I don't know. I'm starting to regret it now. At the time, I felt that the photos weren't very good because I didn't take my proper camera. I just took a small compact camera, and so I didn't feel like the images were as good as they could be. But now, you know, 7 years on, I look at them and I think, well, actually, they're quite good, some of them. So I think I'll post them on my website at some point in the next couple of months.
Oh, that's a great idea. That would be great. Thank you, Noo. Let's turn it over to Darren now. And Darren, from this point, you can advance the slides using the little clicker. And I'll remind you, Darren's a professor at UMass Boston who is an expert on Nigeria and been going to the country for many years.
Thank you, Deb, and thanks to all of you for inviting me to join the conversation, and congrats to Noo on not only a great presentation but an amazing book, which I'm enjoying thoroughly. I'm going to try to touch on some of the issues that Noo mentioned in terms of, you know, of poor governance. How could Nigeria, which has so many resources and such you know, an amazing population, which has such a rich history, be where it is, and how could it squander so much of the benefits that it has? And I think the place to start, really the original sin of Nigeria is European colonization. And it's important to remember that Nigeria really was a collection of nations. Current estimates think that there may be 200 to 300 different ethnic groups that live in the territory of Nigeria, and have only had about 50 years, we're up to now 55 years since independence, to try to build a single nation. So one way I like to think about it, and one way, when I'm trying to explain Nigeria to a lot of other folks, it's like thinking about Nigeria is in many ways more complex than Europe, and was many different nations trying to live under one political roof, without the many years of industrial development that Europe enjoyed, prior to 1960. So in the last 55 years, Nigerians have been trying to build a country out of this many different patchwork. And here you see a political cartoon which sort of makes fun about that, of people all pushing in many different directions. And I think that's really the starting place for understanding Nigeria, is that, and here is a sort of an ethnic breakdown of Nigeria, and this is actually way simplified. If you see, there's in the north up here, and here's I think I can put a little circle around it there. Maybe I didn't. Okay, I was trying to draw. Here we go. No, it's not working. Anyway, I was trying to put a little circle around. You see Kano in the north, where Noo had went up to, and Lagos down here in the southwest, and then Cross River in the southeast, Plateau State in the middle. Oops. Okay, are we on the map now?
Yes, we're on the map.
Yeah. Okay. So if you look at in the middle, Plateau State, where Jos is, that Noo showed, these are many different nations under one roof, and trying to stitch together a coherent political future without the sort of riches that the Europeans have. It's actually incredible to think of how far Nigeria has come in the last 55 years. I mean, speaking as an outsider, and thinking, of course, of in our own American development with our own Civil War and all the different things it took to build the American nation. Nigerians have been trying to do it with not only 200 different ethnic groups, but speaking over 100 different languages. And then if you notice, I've drawn a line from the bottom left up to the top right. That essentially is roughly the religious divide, although it doesn't come exactly along that line. But essentially, most of Nigeria north of that line is a Muslim majority part of the country, and the south of that line is the Christian majority side of the country. So the country is also divided 50-50 Muslim-Christian, which in recent years has become an increasingly volatile fault line. And politicians, as they will, have played the religious card as they have played the ethnic card in their campaigns and for building for building their own political coalitions, have exacerbated these differences over the years. Now, in addition to this great sort of cultural mosaic in Nigeria, as I mentioned, it's also a place where Nigerians have been trying to do it with very little funding. So currently, roughly, 8 out of 10 Nigerians live on less than $2 a day. About 10 years ago, that was 9 out of 10 Nigerians living on less than $2 a day. And about 6 out of 10 live on less than $1 a day. And, giving Nigeria some of the worst social indicators in the world, creating a situation of civil strife. And this is all happening despite the fact that Nigeria makes hundreds of billions of dollars in oil every year. Now, there. This is happening in the last 10 years, interestingly enough, in a circumstance of massive economic growth. So this shows over the last 10 years, well, up until 2010, and then the last couple of years it's dropped off a little bit, but it's still, Nigeria has been averaging close to 7% GDP growth per year, which is not quite as hot as the Chinese economy was during its boom years, but still is far outstripping the growth rates of European and American development. Here's the service sector. Again, just the main thing to see here is you see how the line is going up. The service sector is where, if you're going to find a middle class in Nigeria, that's the likely place you'll find it. And the number of service jobs doubled between 2005 and 2010, as this slide shows. And then from 2010 to 2015, the number has doubled again. This is the number of cell phone lines in Nigeria, which goes from almost 0 in the year 2000 to close to 100 million in 2010. And since 2010, it's even gone even higher. And that includes lines that sometimes people own more than 2 phones, but roughly 2/3 of Nigerians now have a cell phone. So Nigerians are increasingly connected, at least to the cellular world, and more you're finding them connected to Facebook and social media and a lot of other places like that. So you have a booming economy in Nigeria at the moment, and you see at least the small middle class is getting bigger. But yet it's not happening all in the same place. And these are numbers that are a bit old, but the percentages are basically the same 10 years now from then, where you see that the numbers of people in poverty are particularly heavy in northern Nigeria. Southern Nigeria still has high poverty numbers, with the southeast still seeing, a 1/4 of people living in absolute poverty. But in northern Nigeria, it's a tremendously impoverished part of the country. And particularly in the northeast, and when we spend a couple minutes talking about Boko Haram, it takes place. Its genesis is up there in the area where it's some of the poorest parts of Nigeria. And in the top right state in the Nigerian Federation, Borno State, which is the home of the Boko Haram insurgency, it's estimated that if Borno State was an independent country, it would be the poorest country on the planet. Here's the rates of illiteracy. In other words, people who cannot, male children who cannot read or write. And again, you see the numbers are far highest in the northern part of the country. The age at which girls first get married, again, you see the ages are lowest in the north, meaning that girls in the north are getting married on average at the age of 14 in the northwestern part of the country, and 15 in the northeastern part of the country. And of course, the earlier that a girl gets married, the more children she's likely to have over the course of her life. And not surprisingly, the numbers of births in northern Nigeria are far higher than they are in the south, but they're high all across Nigeria. Women in the north are having, over their lifetimes, roughly 9 children. In the south, they're having somewhere around anywhere between 4 and 5, which is still very high rates altogether. But an incredible population explosion happening in northern Nigeria at the same time. Now, Nao mentioned that, and I mentioned as well, the vast oil wealth that Nigeria has, making over $100 billion a year. And she also mentioned that Nigeria went through a long period of military rule. And the combination of a tremendous amount of money coming into a very small circle of hands during military years led to the explosion of corruption, corrupt practices that are still very much in Nigeria today. And because of this massive corruption, a massive leakage of all this money going into the Nigerian government, we see that other countries that have not had the same sort of oil boom have not, even though they've gone through military periods as well, have not suffered the same levels of corruption. And here we just see one simple metric of Ghana doing far better than Nigeria in terms of corruption. And I want to just show one further one, which shows these are human development indicators, and these are basically social development indicators that put together everything, levels of education, levels of health. And the blue line is Ghana, the green line is Nigeria. And we see around 1990, Nigeria and Ghana were pretty close to similar, and both were heavily in military rule during that period. But beginning during these years, and I'm sorry, we don't have numbers for Nigeria in this graph because the African Development Bank doesn't have those numbers at the time. But I've sort of gotten them in other places, and you can see sort of in 2002 when Nigeria blips on their data set, that Nigeria is far behind Ghana, which is really pulling ahead. And what's happening in Ghana that's different than Nigeria up through that period is that Ghana went democratic much earlier than Nigeria. And Ghana had a two-party system, which means that in Ghana, Ghanaians had a political choice to turn to. Nigeria, on the other hand, when it returned to democracy in 1999, had one big, massive party, the People's Democratic Party, and a bunch of smaller parties that were trying to sort of fight for seats at the edges. But what happened this year, for the first time, is that Nigeria finally put together a viable political opposition and had a real two-party contest. And we see President Buhari beating President Jonathan early this year in 2015 by a sizable margin, coming in on a platform of anti-corruption. And so this new government coming in, sort of building on public frustrations with growing corruption and the lack of good governance that Na was talking about, is now in place. And it faces the challenge as to whether it's going to be able to deliver on these promises of trying to turn things around. Let's just spend the last few minutes talking about Boko Haram, because I think it's obviously in the news, but I think it really it underscores this challenge that Nigeria faces. And as Na said, you know, when you meet the Almajiri children on the street in northern Nigeria, and you see the absolute poverty that they're facing in the face of all this oil wealth coming into the country, it creates a whole generation coming up that is frustrated, is disconnected from the oil boom, and is looking for reason in their life, trying to find some sort of meaning. And they're frustrated over the lack of jobs, the lack of healthcare, the lack of good education. And all across the country, militant groups are stepping in and providing this kind of sense of hope. Go ahead, Deb.
Sorry, I didn't actually say anything.
Okay. So these sorts of militant groups are stepping in and providing youth in particular some sort of sense of meaning and hope. In the southern Nigerian and in the oil producing regions where Na is from, you have oil militant gangs essentially that really provide young men a real way of making money. If you've got a gun in your hand, and if you create a little bit of trouble, the government initially tries to get rid of you, but if they can't, they try to buy you off. And so many of the oil militias have been put on government payrolls as a way to try to keep them quiet, and it provides a good steady sense of living. In the Northeast, on the other hand, a lot of youth have turned to religion. And in particular, these sorts of radical groups have been very popular in some circles. And Boko Haram really rose out of that sort of anger and frustration, particularly state corruption. But I think that's an important starting place for understanding Boko Haram, is that it shares this common thread that people all across Nigeria have, which is, absolute frustration at a government that's making maybe $100 billion a year, its inability to provide basic electricity, basic roads, basic education in a way that is acceptable. And it's in this context that groups like Boko Haram, which in many ways is really a cult, it certainly starts with the kind of the neo-Wahhabist sort of rhetoric that Al-Qaeda and groups like that believe in, but Boko Haram has taken it very much in a idiosyncratic cult-like way, offering a utopian vision of the world based on a belief that Islam's golden age was the 100 years right after the late years of the Prophet and the century or so after his death, when Muslims were really living life the way that it should be. And so therefore they have this sense of, let's get back to that sort of lifestyle. And so returning back to a period of time when men and women lived in a certain way, when society was structured in a certain way. And so I think it explains to some extent, their absolute hostility toward Western styles of education, But also, too, it's important to remember that the elite in Nigeria are all Western educated. Many of the elite have schooled in Britain and the United States and other places. So in their attack on secular education, they're really attacking the elite and their Western style of living. But Boko Haram was not violent at first. It was really very much a sort of a quiet movement living on the fringes. But the political class in the north initially tried to co-opt the movement for legitimacy purposes, because as they were getting popular, the political leaders wanted to engage them. But then when that didn't work out, they then sent the police in to attack them, which led to a cycle of violence that led Boko Haram down the path of violence. And I think that's very important, because if Boko Haram is wiped out, and it looks like the government is making progress in that direction, we're really only waiting until the next Boko Haram rises. If the roots of the movement are not dealt with, which are the poverty, the poor governance we've talked about already, and really trying to provide some sort of sense of hope. And maybe that's where I'll end, is that Nigeria faces these narratives of frustration across the north, and Islam has its own version, of which Boko Haram is only the most radical portion of it, whereas the Christianity also in the south also has its own narratives of frustration at the state, narratives over what it sees as a expanding Islam. Islam sees Christianity expanding in the north, so frustrations with each other. And we see politicians playing these religious cards in ways that stoke up anger back and forth. But yet, you also see a growing middle class, as I mentioned. You see a growing economic boom in Nigeria, and we now have a government in place that has, as political opposition, has fought its way into office through the ballot box, offering to deal with corruption and offering to try to offer Nigerians some hope. I think if Ghana is any model, it's going to take some time before any government's going to be able to deal with any of these issues. But it really matters that there is this sort of two-party system where Nigerians have an alternative to turn to try to support with these sorts of frustrations that they have. And if the current governing party doesn't work, then the previous governing party will be able to say, look, put us back in power and we will deal with these issues. And hopefully in this circumstance where you have a political choice, these sorts of radical groups, the militants in the south, Boko Haram in the north, other sort of groups around the country will look less appealing, and hopefully politics will begin to offer some sort of possibility for change. And in my mind, Nigeria is going to make it. I think it's a question of whether it's a 10-year or 40-year plan. If the government is able to really tackle the key issues, then I think in 10 years we can see Nigeria in a very different place. If the current government sort of muddles around and gets corrupt like the previous government did, then I think Nigerians will do it on their own in 40 years with the economic boom that's happening, and will eventually force the political class to provide good governance. My hope is that it happens in 10 years and not 40 years, but we'll wait to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. That was an enlightening look at modern Nigeria from a different angle. So we've had two takes on the contemporary Nigerian scene, sort of the ground level view and the kind of bird's eye view. And what I'd like to do now is give everyone a chance to ask questions and get responses to them. I'm going to dial back to some of the questions from earlier in the webinar, and now is a great time, if you've been shaping a question, to put it in the chat box, hit enter, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. So starting out with a question for Na, Marcy asks, you did say the people, which you found heartwarming, yet the government is still very corrupt. Shanty towns are being demolished. The university is no longer as good. The amusement park is decaying. Yet you still went back home feeling better about the Nigeria that killed your father. Why is that? So now if you want to try out your video feed to answer that question, we'll try to do this in a live manner. forward?
All right. So what was the question again? Why did I feel?
Why did you feel better about the Nigeria that killed your father at the end of the journey than from the beginning?
Well, I mean, when my father was killed in 1995, we had a military dictatorship. Now we have a semblance of democracy, and you can now that the people have a little bit more of a voice and space to make money and whatnot. You can see change happening. It's very slow, but there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. Nigeria is just a very sort of patchy country. You can just you can go to one area, see lots of poverty, then you can go somewhere else and be amazed. We have this huge film industry called Nollywood, and we've had a sort of international standard film that was released last year, Half of the Yellow Sun, which is an adaptation of Chimamanda Adichie's book. So things are really changing, and it's just such a fun country. Even if people are suffering, they really make you laugh, and it's absolutely fascinating. And so that's the thing. When you go to Nigeria, it's impossible to come away with just totally negative views of it. You always get a bit of both, good and bad.
I was so struck, Na, in your book that you wrote about the happiness of the people, and that it seemed more than most places, even on by measures of human happiness, that Nigeria ranks near the top. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it's to do with religion. I think religion really sustains people. As I said, they're very Christian and very Muslim up in the north, and there's something about Pentecostalism that really imbues people with sense of optimism. They go to church, they listen to these very charismatic preachers. And if you go to a good church where the preacher is very honest and truly lives by the Bible and speaks God's words, it can give you a really it can make you feel very uplifted, and so Nigerians always have Christianity, particularly Christianity, gives them a real inner strength, and they channel that into their everyday lives, whether it's trying to make money for their families or trying to go to university. You always hear people say, I will achieve my goals, by force. That's what they always say, by force. And so even though I feel that sometimes praying for stuff is not going to get you what you want, in a sense it actually does, because praying boosts your morale, and it's only when you're feeling optimistic, when you're feeling proactive, that you're more likely to achieve your goals. And so that's what Nigeria is all about. People feel that whatever hardships they're going through at the moment, it's temporary, and eventually good things will come.
Great, thank you. Here's a question from a student. Since you grew up in England and your family is from Nigeria, which one do you consider your home?
Gosh, well, I mean, in terms of my identity, because I grew up, I was born in Nigeria to Nigerian parents, but I didn't actually get a British passport till I was 20. So I was actually a foreigner in England. So it's a very sort of complicated situation in that I feel like London's my home. I love London. It's a very cosmopolitan place. I grew up just outside London. And so, this is my home for the time being, and I can't see myself moving anywhere else in the near future. But, you're once a Nigerian, always a Nigerian, My name, my family, my ancestors, they're all from Nigeria. And when I go back to my hometown, everyone can pronounce my name correctly. It's the only place in the world where people can pronounce my name correctly. And it's, it's a wonderful feeling. And so, you feel like in some ways you're at home, but it's home in a different sense. It's not, you know, home as in where you hang out and live on an everyday basis. It's a bit deeper than that. So, you know, it's both. I'm British and Nigerian. Some people don't understand that, but, you know, that's just how it is.
Thank you. This is a question for either one of you. Kathleen would like to know, which are the oil companies who are doing the most polluting and causing the most spills? Can the UN do anything to help? So maybe, Darren, do you want to take this question?
Sure. Oh, I didn't put my video on.
Give it a click, see if it works.
It's not working, so I'll just talk. There are a number of multinational oil companies in Nigeria, but there are also there are local oil companies as well that are also at work. The biggest multinational generally has been Shell, which, you know, of course, received infamy for the role it played in the death of Noo's father. But Chevron is also there. The big Italian and French oil companies are there, and in more recent years, the Russians and the Indians are also present, and of course the Chinese are very much there. So there's a tremendous amount of international players interested in what's happening in the oil-producing regions. They will always protest to say that, you know, that they don't really call the shots in the oil-producing region. They always say it's really the government. It's the government's responsibility to develop the country. It's the government's it's the government's power to decide which oil company gets to drill in the area and to enforce the regulations. So they will constantly say that, and to some extent there's certainly some truth in that, especially since roughly half of the funding from the oil goes back to the Nigerian government. But really the oil companies, of course, could do so much more, and they are benefiting from the current situation as well. So it's a complicated circumstance. And the United Nations has tried to mediate at several times, and at one point actually sent in a special representative to try to look around. But the Nigerian government has been dead set against this, and has always rejected UN involvement when it can, and has tried to undermine it when it has to accept it. And this is largely because many of the ruling figures in governments in the past have been benefiting from the corruption in the oil industry, and they don't want any international scrutiny over what's going on. There's some hope that the new government's going to try to reform the oil sector, and they've said that they're going to look into it. But it's really at the heart of the corruption empire in the country, and it's going to take some time to try to change that.
Thanks, Darren. We have a question from Karen for Na. The question is, why on the copyright page of your book is there a disclaimer that this is a work of fiction? I think it says names, characters, places, and incidents are the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously.
I didn't know that. Really? It says that?
I think it's actually a standard thing that I've seen on many memoir type books now. I think it's a protection for the publisher. But maybe you can speak to your take on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I did change some names. I would say maybe 2/3 of the names were changed, just because it's just easier, you know. When you're writing a book like this, you're writing from your own perspective, and it's amazing how you know, you can write something that to you is just completely ordinary and, you know, harmless or whatever. But you'd be amazed at how, you know, other people can look at it and you know, dispute or, you know, just have a slightly different take on it. And so it's just easier to change names so that you know, you can just protect people's identities. And there was one case, I think in the book, when I was in Jos, in the center of the country, I was talking to a woman at the Film Institute who was, you know, she wasn't anti-Muslim, but, you know, in that particular city, there's a real battle between Christians and Muslims as to, you know, who's going to dominate politically. And so when it comes to voting, according to this woman, the Muslims exaggerate their numbers. And so she was on a mission to get Christians to vote. And so she was going on and on about this in the book. And, you know, and I asked her, you know, do you mind if I write about this? And she was like, yes, it's absolutely fine. But this was in 2008. And when this book was published, about 3 years later, Boko Haram was now really causing problems in northern Nigeria. And so I felt that even though this woman had said to me at the time, in 2008, that it was fine to print what she'd written, I felt that perhaps she'd be in danger now if I revealed her name. And so I changed it. And so, you know, I think, you know, you have to do that sometimes when you're writing nonfiction. And so I think, you know, some people will say that if you change details like that, then I guess in a very technical sense, what you've written is fiction because it's not 100% true. It's 99.99% true. So yeah, I think that's what it is.
Thank you so much. We have a question about resources and other books and materials for learning about Nigeria. So I'm going to use that as a segue to allow Karen, our librarian, to briefly introduce the toolkit we've developed for people who are thinking of using this book in their classroom. So Karen, you're on.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Deb. So we've put together this teacher toolkit for our global read, and it has a variety of resources that we hope will provide some context and ideas for teaching with the book and learning more about Nigeria. And we've put the URL up in the chat box because a link on my slide is not clickable. But this is the home page, or an image of the home page, or part of the home page, and it has author interviews and reviews of the book. And from there you can navigate to the other tabs in the toolkit. And I'm just going to click through to the next one. And this is our Transwonderland tour. It's a story map that's interactive and includes photos, video, quotations from the book. It allows you to trace Noo's journey on a map of Nigeria and zoom in and out. For example, one stop on the tour is Kano. And we have photographs. We have a video of actually this year's celebration of the Durbar in Kano. So that is one example of a stop on the Transwonderland map that we've created. On the Teaching Connections page, this is a page that has links to resources related to themes from the book that are connected to various curriculum topics, such as world religions, environmental issues, arts and culture, and the history of the slave trade. So these thematically organized resources are correlated with specific pages in Looking for Transwonderland. And we also have Nigeria resources. This is where you'll find links to lesson plans and teaching modules about Nigeria, as well as some recommended books, both fiction and nonfiction. So someone was asking specifically about book recommendations. This only shows you part of the page. There's a lot more on that page. And we also have a page on travelogues and memoirs. Again, recommended books and also some essays, including some recommendations from our Global Read author herself. Finally, we have a discussions question page that's still to come, and will include selected questions from our discussion here this afternoon, as well as guiding questions for classroom discussion. We'll also embed the recorded webinar once it's available. So we hope these resources, along with this afternoon's wonderful presentations, will inspire you to bring Looking for Transwonderland into your classrooms. and learn and teach about the rich culture and history of Nigeria. And please feel free to share this resource widely. We also encourage you to visit our website for additional resources for teaching. And I'm trying to advance the slide here. Here we go. And we encourage you to sign up for our, online for our newsletter and teacher digest and connect with us on social media. And we hope you'll join us for future webinars and other courses. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Deb for just a few closing words.
Right. I just wanted to thank both Noo and Darren for such eloquent and compact presentations. I think in the course of just over an hour, you've shed more light on Nigeria than many of us have been able to gain from the headlines in a much longer period. If you both have maybe a closing thought or something you want to make sure that we go away with, I want to give you the chance to offer it up now, and then we'll all say goodnight. So, Noo, perhaps we'll take you first.
Well, I guess, Nigeria is just a very, very complex country. And, you can talk to 10 Nigerians and you will get, 12 different opinions about the country. So it's important to read a wide variety of, books and sources to get a real understanding of Nigeria. That's all I'd say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noo. We've loved your book and loved having you with us tonight. Darren, do you have a parting comment? Just activate your mic there.
Sorry, I turned on the video and I was trying to do both. Can you hear me now okay?
Yes, and we can see you live on video too.
Well, good, maybe for the last second at least. I guess I wanted to end on a feeling of hope in the sense that there are tremendous problems in Nigeria. And as we went through very quickly, I mean, there are all sorts of reasons for doubt, and there have been a lot of articles written, particularly by Westerners like me, proclaiming that Nigeria was going to fall apart. But yet Nigeria persists, and I think it's because of the Nigerian people themselves, who deserve a tremendous amount of credit. The great Nigerian singer Fela Kuti talks about suffering and smiling. And in many ways, Nigerians somehow just always amaze me with this incredible spirit of entrepreneurship and of really force of character that I think is going to succeed someday, despite the fact that the political leadership has not caught up in terms of their understanding of how to govern the country. But I think one day they will. And I think, our children will certainly grow up in a world where Nigeria is a very different place.
Thank you, Darren, for those hopeful comments. It's a wonderful note to end on today, and we'll keep following Nigeria as it progresses over these years under this reformist leader. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and we hope to see you again. Thanks again, and have a wonderful night. Goodbye.